presenter, it tells me. All right, excellent. Okie doke. So welcome, everybody. It looks like we have a really outstanding crowd this morning, and I'm happy to see that. First of all, you may have heard the saying that it never rains in Southern California. Don't believe it. We're kind of soggy out here. It's been raining all night, as it's been raining for about 3 months. And at this point, the reservoirs are full, and people are starting to look at where they can buy a boat. Hope it's sunny where you are. I am going to split up the presentation with George and Ben, and I'm going to kick it off and talk about the origin of the approach that we're going to talk about today to performance management. First of all, CEO has been working on performance management throughout its entire history. Our very first project was a performance management study led by Monty Moorman. Our first big multi-company study was on performance management as well, led by Monty, and Ed Lawler was also involved in that, working with a number of companies, and that led to a book and a number of articles and a study that was really ahead of its time. George and Ed did studies of contemporary practice in 2002 and 2012, focusing on large U.S. firms. In the last couple of years, George and Ed and I have done a major study of cutting-edge practices, which include ongoing feedback, ratingless appraisal, and crowdsourced feedback with support from World at Work. And then finally, George and I did a study of ratingless appraisal in an insurance company, very high-quality study, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. So we've been around the block on performance management. We've seen a lot, and we've learned a few things. The origin of the study that we're going to talk about today and the approach came out of a meeting that we had last May with the Center's Advisory Board. We talked about various directions that we might take next, and one of the ideas that we had was to talk about performance feedback culture. And this really resonated with people around the table. So what we said was decades of looking at different techniques hasn't gotten us all that far. And in many ways, you could look at what's happening now in performance management with the focus on how often we talk to people and whether we have a rating or not, and if so, how many points on the rating scale, and who exactly provides the feedback and what techniques we use to collect the data. All of that is just one more iteration in a long line that goes back for decades of trying to find the best techniques. So our feeling is, in a lot of ways, that's like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. It's not getting us to the level of effectiveness that we'd really like to see. And maybe a different way to go would be to look at the culture of the organization, which probably in the end is a lot more important than technique anyway. So it's our observation, working with companies over the years, that if there's a strong management culture where people feel compelled to deliver good, honest, two-way developmental feedback, you can get by with pretty dated techniques. If you have a bad culture, the most perfect and modern techniques in the world are not going to be enough to keep you from failing. So then the question becomes, how exactly do we define this culture, and how do we create it? So we're going to make a case for each of these points during the course of the webinar. Oops. Let's see. There we go. The first big piece of this argument is going to be made by George, and he's going to take a look at the history of doing research on performance management. So George, who I might add is this year's winner of the Rick Steves lookalike contest, will take.
Thanks, Gerry.
Welcome. Take the section.
So thank you, everybody, for participating and calling in today. I want to set up our current work that we're going to talk about in just a minute with a little review of what we think we can contribute to what's known about performance management, performance appraisal in general, and some of the previous research in this area, of which there has been quite a bit. Performance appraisal, performance management, performance feedback is one of the most covered topics in management research, going back 100 years now to some of the earliest studies in organizational behavior and industrial organization. Just since 1980, over 1,200 studies have been identified, including some 30-plus meta-analyses or studies of different topics related to performance evaluation. We at the center have gone through and done our best to summarize a lot of this literature to prepare for the work that we're doing now. If you're interested in this kind of work as well, there was a very well done technical report that was done by the Center for Evidence-Based Management, which is based in Europe and published by CIPD over in the UK, about assessing the current research literature on performance appraisal. And it's written from a non-academic perspective, a little bit more accessible than most of this the work to individual studies. In terms of the topics that these hundreds and thousands of studies have covered over the years, I've summarized some of the big categories. The first one being employee reactions to feedback, mainly looking at the types of individual characteristics that would lead people to respond more positively or negatively to different kinds of performance appraisal feedback, things like their self-esteem or their locus of control or their openness to feedback, their personality characteristics primarily. There's also been a ton of research on the characteristics of the feedback. What types of things do managers give to employees, their subordinates, either in writing or in person, as simple as whether or not the feedback is positive versus negative. A lot of research on the perceived fairness of the feedback, both in how the ratings were done, how the feedback was delivered, and then how the ratings feed into other types of HR systems, including promotion and compensation. There's been a good bit of research on how the feedback is given in terms of perceived usefulness. The coaching research falls into this category. So what kinds of details do you give employees about how to improve their current job performance, or whether it's more vague developmental kinds of statements. There's also quite a bit of research on rating behavior and errors, which is a very kind of technical way of thinking about what are the characteristics of both the format and then the raters, meaning the managers, that lead them to either be lenient in their performance appraisals or overly harsh in their performance appraisals. What kinds of tools are the ratings perceived as more fair and more useful, for example. There's also a lot of research on the social influences of performance appraisal, so organizational politics or impression management behavior on the part of subordinates and how that changes managers' impressions of their overall performance. Researchers call some of this contextual performance, which is basically the other parts of your job and how you behave other than your KPIs or the goals, the quantitative goals that have been set for you. In terms of training, there's a lot of research on, for example, making managers more aware of how their ratings compare to others within the organization, how to give feedback, and in general, a lot of that shows that managerial training is quite effective. The last big category of research is on appraisal processes. So what are the purposes of the ratings? And this research tends to show, for example, that managers change the way they get feedback if they know that the ratings are going to be used for developmental purposes versus administrative purposes or for promotion and compensation decisions. A lot of research on 360 review, both in terms of how the participants give feedback as well as how people see feedback from their peers. And then finally, a lot of various research on rating formats, whether that's results-based or SMART goals or behavioral goals through a competency model, or even things like, does it matter if you use a 3-point or a 5-point or a 7-point scale? So that's a review of a lot of the research topics that's out there. Gerry, can you move us on to the next slide?
Yep.
in general, what this research shows is that the feedback reactions and performance improvement based on performance management are quite mixed. And this is a chart from a meta-analysis or a study of studies that was done 20 years ago now, but our review of the literature since that time would suggest that these findings are going to be pretty consistent over the research that's been done more recently. What this shows is that many of the studies that have examined performance feedback and performance appraisal have actually found negative effects on performance. And the main reason is that what this research tends to show is it's not the feedback that drives performance, it's employees' reactions to the feedback, which is the critical differentiator. So if people perceive it to be unuseful or unfair or something that threatens their ego or self-esteem, they're likely to have negative effects on it. So 1/3 of the studies find negative performance. On balance, the average is positive, but it's clear that there's a lot of what researchers call moderating conditions, which are it depends on actually how it's done. Gerry, can you move us to the next one? This fits with a lot of the research that we've been doing over the past several years, and I'll just mention a couple of the studies, the big ones. Gerry already alluded to these. The first one was a 2016 survey that we did with the World at Work, looking at what we called cutting-edge performance appraisal practices. So we asked companies if they had any of these particular practices in place, and we focused on 3 big ones. Ongoing feedback, which is more frequent check-ins, at least quarterly, with your employees. Ratingless appraisals, that's basically developmental-based feedback without a number or a rating attached to it. And then the final one was crowdsourced feedback, which is kind of a new cutting-edge technique that changes traditional performance feedback from a strictly downward, from your manager to your subordinate, to basically it's a 360-degree appraisal, but it's a little bit different in that all of your goals are now going to be online and you're going to get feedback from everywhere in the organization. Quite interesting stuff that is going on out there. We asked companies that were using these to self-report how they perceived their efficacy, and in general they said that there's a number of positive outcomes both in terms of employee performance and employee satisfaction and managerial satisfaction with these systems. So it's clear that things are changing, but we need a lot of more research in these areas about these new practices to truly understand them.
And just to make an editorial comment, while they're reporting positive effects, they weren't impressively positive effects. So people would be at about a 5 on a 7-point scale.
Yeah. And that fits with the slides that we were seeing before, with the small marginal positive effects for feedback and performance appraisals on balance. The last one that I'll mention is a study that we did with an insurance company that was piloting a ratingless program. Now, this is an organization that had gone through a series of large-scale initiatives to try to improve coaching and feedback within the organization. So they had a coaching initiative. They put managers through training. They already had really effective, from what we've seen, performance management systems in place, and had really tried to create this culture of coaching within the organization. They asked us to come in about 6 months before they piloted a ratingless program in a portion of their organization. We were able to look at before and after data, so we had a pilot and a control group. We surveyed people beforehand. They rolled out the ratingless performance appraisal. We did another survey with employees and managers following that. And the interesting thing that we found, honestly a little bit to the company's disappointment, was that the ratingless processes were not actually driving satisfaction with the performance appraisal system and the feedback that employees got and their attitudes following. We asked them about their motivation. We asked them about their learning. What we did find that made the most difference was the coaching behavior on the part of the managers, whether or not employees perceived their feedback to be developmental versus evaluative, and then the final one was the frequency of which the managers were given feedback. So on balance, what that showed is that it's not the rating that was really driving employee attitudes and motivation. What was driving it was the coaching, the development, and the frequency of the feedback. Gerry, can you go to the next slide for us?
Yep.
if you take all of this research together, I think it is safe to say that we do know some things about the way in which feedback is used in organizations, how employees react to it, and what drives motivation following feedback. And in general, if we have to summarize, it's the number one, you have to have a good manager that you trust and have a good relationship with them. The feedback is what matters. A lot of this research shows that numbers, ratings, rankings, particularly forced rankings, just complicate things. It doesn't mean that you can't have effective systems that use numbers or ratings. It just means that it's a lot more difficult. A lot of those moderating conditions then come into play around perceived fairness, etc. Interpersonally, when managers give feedback, the research is pretty consistent, showing that the best feedback is positive. It's forward-looking, meaning how to do better in your job as opposed to what you were doing perhaps wrong or could be improved based on your previous work. It's perceived to be fair. It's non-threatening to the employee, both to their ego as well as the interpersonal side of how the feedback is delivered. The best feedback is done for developmental purposes as opposed to administrative or rating purposes. And then finally, it includes the employee in the process. So it gives them a voice, and the manager needs to be working with the employee to make sure that the goal is improving performance for everybody's benefit, not so much in terms of evaluation and backward-looking kind of feedback. The challenge is that while we know a lot of the research about how employees react to feedback and what good feedback looks like, there is very little research that suggests how to encourage managers to deliver this kind of feedback. And so this really changed the way that we were thinking about performance evaluation and performance management research, and this is really the goal of the project that we have going forward, which is how to make these findings actionable, or how to create a culture and a climate in which managers give feedback that's fair, positive, forward-looking on a regular basis, done for developmental purposes, and includes some employee participation. So to talk about the climate and culture background that we're using for the study, I'm going to turn it over now to Ben.
And let me just do a quick introduction to Ben before we do that. For those of you who are longtime observers of CEO, you may or may not have seen the webinars and other things that Ben's done for us, but we are really delighted to have him as one of our affiliates. Ben has, for decades, researched the topic of organizational culture applied to a lot of different aspects of organizational life. So we couldn't have a better person to work with us on this aspect of the study. And Ben, I'll let you take it away.
Oh, now I really have to do something, huh?
Now you better be good.
Yeah. So, I mean, from what you've heard so far, it looks like it's possible to improve performance management and performance feedback if you have people doing the kinds of things they should be doing. And the question becomes, well, how do you get them to do the kinds of things that we know they should be doing? And the answer that we came up with for this particular project is that it's the context that matters. I like to tell people it's the culture, stupid. And so, but this organizational culture thing is really somewhat complicated, somewhat difficult to grab a hold of. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how it got started and how you actually can get your hands around what culture might be. Sometimes I use the term climate or culture might be, and how you can get your hands around it and do something with it. So it grabbed executives' attention back in the 80s. I think the first big book was In Search of Excellence by Peters and Waterman. And what they did is they looked across a whole bunch of organizations and deduced some characteristics that successful organizations had, and reached some conclusions about the kind of culture that was created in those organizations. So one of the problems with that research that they did is that subsequent follow-up yielded information that not all of the ones that were excellent when they looked at them remained excellent. But nevertheless, the idea that the context created for employees in the company was important has persisted, especially when we began to think about organizational culture vis-a-vis, tribes and ancient peoples and the kinds of rites and rituals. Especially Deal and Kennedy talked about the rites and rituals of organizations. I'm going to use a different word later, and it's a word I'll come back to. It's the word I'm going to use is habits. What are the kinds of habits that organizations have in the way they do things? So this culture idea, it's all about the implicit values and expectations that people experience in their companies at work. And the problem with them is they're implicit. And so you have to get your hands around, well, what are the kinds of things that happen? What are the kinds of things that happen that lead people to have this sense of what the implicit values and expectations of the company are? So the good thing about culture is that it is a subtle guide to behavior. That is, people are not necessarily aware of why they do things the way they do things, or why they focus on the kinds of things they focus on, but these implicit values and expectations serve to reduce the ambiguity that people can have at work. So, if I have to decide on what am I going to focus, or am I going to take this break, or how am I going to do this performance feedback, right, the topic that we're talking about now, if the right kind of culture exists, then that will be a guide, a subtle guide to behavior, and it reduces ambiguity about the way we do things. But culture is not just values and expectations. Culture has to come from something. And I like to focus on the kinds of behavior that leads to culture. Ed Schein, who I think is like the best absolute writer on organizational culture, he talks about what he calls culture embedding mechanisms. So the mechanisms are the behaviors. And the kinds of behaviors that he talks about, I've listed here. Okay, so what leaders pay attention to? So leaders have to make choices about what kinds of rewards they'll give, who they'll give their rewards to, what kind of recognition there will be, and to what they will allocate scarce resources. So people pay attention to the kinds of decisions that leaders make, and they see the kinds of things that leaders tend to reward and tend to recognize and tend to give resources to. And those behaviors on the part of leaders are one of the pieces that lead people to have ideas about the values and expectations that their company has. The second feature is how leaders make decisions. So the leaders make unilateral decisions? Do they make poorly planned decisions? Do they make arbitrary decisions, or do they take consideration of people's ideas into account? Do they negotiate? Do they give voice to other people's opinions, and so forth? So how leaders make decisions tells people a lot about the kinds of impressions they have about the way management thinks about them as contributors to decision makers. And then the last thing is who leaders recruit. So the kinds of people that leaders bring into an organization, the kinds of people they recruit, select, promote, and I love this term, excommunicate. So who gets to stay in the organization? Who gets to get in the organization? Recruitment, selection, promotion, and excommunication. So these three things, what, how, and who, tell people in organizations about the kinds of things that are important to the leaders, the way that leaders go about doing things, and the kinds of people with whom they feel they can work well. Okay, next, Gerry. So companies have cultures that is kind of like overarching cultures, and companies also have subcultures. Now, the subcultures are not in conflict with the larger organizational culture, but they carry out the larger organizational culture in ways that make sense for them. And I use here the example of an airline. I picked Southwest because a lot of people are familiar with the kind of culture Southwest has for service and excellence. So, but within Southwest, the baggage handlers don't go about their work the same way the customer service reps that you interact with go about their work, or that the flight crews who handle the flight go about their work. So these different, you might call them occupational subcultures or job subcultures, these different job subcultures out Southwest also, because of different work processes, language, and personalities may differ, but they all represent, in their way, the overall culture of efficiency and customer care that characterizes Southwest. And there's a lot been written. There are cases about Southwest and the way they pay attention to the way resources get allocated, who gets brought into the organization. I mean, I've seen some statistics that Southwest hires maybe 3 to 7% of the people who apply for jobs there. They're very careful about the people they choose and the way Southwest goes about making decisions. So the effectiveness of Southwest depends on the effectiveness, right, of the subculture and the larger culture. And this little metaphor that we have there with the coffee beans, you see, there are different kinds of coffee beans, but they're all coffee beans, and they represent, when brought together, a really good blend of coffee and what we would talk about, a really good blend of the larger culture. And when they blend, we have a strong culture. And the goal in many companies is to have a strong culture. And by strong, we mean that there's sharedness. People agree on the kinds of values and expectations. Now, one of the problems with a strong culture, of course, is that if it's too strong, it can't be flexible. That is, it can have negative consequences. You know, if baggage is too much like customer service, well, maybe the baggage isn't going to move so quickly. Anyway, the key to culture is to be strong and flexible. Next, Gerry. But for me, a key to what makes a strong culture effective is that when the culture is focused, when it has tangible foci, not just one focus, but like at Southwest, it has excellence, service excellence, and speed, and efficiency, and attention to operations procedures, and so forth. There's convincing evidence when those facets of the organization have a focus on this service delivery, then it's going to create the kind of habits. Remember, I talked about habits, the kind of habits that people have. There's this wonderful book by Charles Duhigg, D-U-H-I-G-G. The book is called The Power of Habits. And most people think it's about individuals' habits. But the really cool thing that Duhigg does in the book is he talks about organizational habits. And I've started to adopt his language of habits for climate and culture because habits connote behavior. And it's the behavior that we're interested in. So focus prioritizes for people. Remember that idea that it's subtle hints, subtle guides to behavior. It prioritizes for people where they should direct their effort and energy because the goals become clarified. So if we know that the focus of this organization is service and efficiency and speed, if we know that, then when we have a choice about how we're going to behave, then we know how to behave. And when you have a strong culture like that, with a strong focus, it eliminates the need for excessive rules and bureaucracy. So those rules and bureaucracy are the kinds of things that we think that the performance management, performance feedback research has focused on. You know, technique, not the larger context or culture in which it's being done. Okay, so there's considerable evidence now for the importance of focus for climate and culture. We have lots of meta-analysis, you know, studies of studies showing how service climate predicts customer satisfaction, or safety climate predicts injuries and accidents. There's research in England that's just unbelievable about patient-oriented culture predicting patient outcomes, and across hospitals, patient-oriented culture predicts mortality rates in hospitals. So, I mean, this is really amazing stuff. And then there's the idea about a quality-oriented culture. And what it does is it produces product and service quality and also productivity. So there are many benefits to this focus of a climate or culture in organizations. Okay, Gerry.
Okay, there you go.
Okay, thanks. So as I said, there's these studies of studies in banks, hotels, restaurants, hair salons, the service climate, and the corrected correlation across all these studies is about 0.23. You may say, well, that's not a very high correlation, but that's a very practical correlation. It has important consequences. I'm going to show you a slide in a second for that. So effects of safety, climate, and injuries, about the same. So I've done a study where we looked at the company level of analysis, right, between 20 and 33 companies. The service climate on the American Customer Satisfaction Index, which is out of the University of Michigan, many of you know. So the correlation within a year was 0.42. From 1 year to the next year was 0.51, and from 1 year to 2 years out was still 0.38. So let's look at the next slide. You'll see what this looks like. So here's a correlation. This is 27 branches of a bank where I did this project, and we're looking at service climate on the bottom, right, on the x-axis. These are employee reports aggregated within the 27 branches, plotted against the customer reports on the y-axis, right, of the service quality they experience. And you can see this is a very, very tight relationship for this focus on service climate with regard to the service quality that customers experience. Okay, Gerry. So Gerry's going to take over now, and he's going to talk about the way we're thinking about this focus of culture on performance management and performance feedback, and the way we think it's going to get ended, if you will, in the kind of feedback that gets created for employees.
So as you see on this slide, there are 3 levels that we're looking at in the study. We're first looking at organizational culture and performance management practices. Now, when we talk about organization in the study that we're doing, we mean the unit within the corporation, so not the entire corporation, but the part of it that may have a subculture because of the kind of business that they're in and so forth. So in a bank, you might have investment banking compared to the branch system where you have utterly different cultures because of the kind of people that are there and the kind of business that they do and the time horizon of the work and so forth. So we'll look at those, how those aspects of culture then are experienced by managers as a feedback culture, and then how that translates at the employee level to a feedback climate. So it's like stress and strain. So culture would be the macro phenomenon, and then how employees experience it we talk about as the climate. The important issue is how do you create the right kind of feedback culture? So we know a lot about what kind of performance feedback culture is going to make a difference, but how do we get managers to deliver that honest, two-way, partly developmental feedback that's of high quality? There probably are not an infinite number of ways to do it. This is the list that we've thought of. Please contribute if you've got any others to add to the list. The first two are what most companies do. One is communication, which is exhortation, and training to give people some practice at delivering the right kind of feedback. We think some of the others may actually be more important. One of the most important is modeling. So managers will take a lot of cues from their superiors about how they really need to behave. So if the communication and training says you need to behave one way, but their executives are behaving a very different way, guess which wins out? One that, as far as we can tell, is rarely done is good monitoring. If we say we want managers to behave in a particular way as they give feedback to employees, how do we know that they did it? And if we don't know, it's difficult to course correct and get managers to change the behavior. Rewards and punishments. Do we reward managers for doing it correctly? And do we take some action if they won't? Exactly what gets reinforced in the organization is critical to making sure the right kind of behavior is there. And then finally, there's selection. Some managers simply are never going to be able to deliver the right kind of feedback because of the kind of people that they are, and some people do it as a matter of course. Do we have selection processes for hiring managers from the outside or promoting from within that let us get the right kind of people there? These are the practices that we'll be looking at in the study in more detail, but we suspect that that's where the rubber meets the road in creating the right kind of performance feedback culture. I'd like to take a few minutes. We're going to leave about 15 minutes for a conversation with you, taking your questions, but I'd like to take a few minutes to tell you about the new CEO study that is underway, where we're taking a look at the issues that we've described so far. So first of all, the goals of the study are to look at the relationships between organizational culture, feedback culture, and managerial and employee attitudes and behaviors, including the climate. Second, we want to take the practical angle of how exactly do companies go about creating a feedback culture in which managers feel like they've got to do it right. The methodology will be looking in at least 10 companies, and each company that participates will offer up 3 or more subcultures per company. They can do as many as they want. There's no upper limit on that, and some are talking about having a number of different ones involved. If we get the numbers that we're talking about, we'll have 30 to 50 organizations, that is the subcultures, that we'll be able to look at and draw some conclusions statistically. We're doing 3 surveys. One is a sample of managers in each of these organizations within the company. We'll look at the employees reporting to those managers in another survey. And then finally, we'll ask about the performance management practices and other characteristics of the organization with 1 key informant per organization. We'll also match up the survey responses to records data from the HRIS in the company, looking at things like demographics, prior performance ratings, if there are any, promotion and salary history, and so forth. At this point, we have a number of study participants that have committed to the project and we've begun working with. We have gotten permission to mention 3 of them, Microsoft, Cigna, and PwC. And there are some others that didn't get back to us on whether we could drop their name. But we're looking for a few more sites. So if you're interested, by all means, the way to learn more about this is to contact us. We are interested in both large and medium-sized companies. So far, every company that's participating is a Fortune 100, but we're interested in mid-sized companies as well. The timeline for the project, we're going to be collecting data this spring. We hope to have collected most of it by April 30th. The surveys are all ready to go, so as soon as you are ready, we can begin collecting data. Companies that participate get feedback reports both through the company and each of its organizations that participate within 6 weeks of data collection. We'll then pull all the data together from all the companies that participated, do some analysis around what we found and what companies can do to create the right kind of culture, et cetera, that we'd like to have done by about August 1. And then in the fall, we'll put together a conference of the participants that will be action-oriented, let them hear from each other about things that they're doing that are working particularly well, and hear about the results. And we'll be guided by when we can get all the data collected and analyzed, but we're thinking September, October is the time frame for that. We've talked about what the prior literature has to say. We've suggested that culture and climate may be a better way to look at how we create effective performance management. We'd expect, based on prior research, to see stronger effects if we do that than by looking continually at techniques. And we're putting together a study that would get at this. But what we'd like to do now is turn things over to you and hear your questions and comments and challenges for us. The photo there, by the way, is in honor of Puppy Bowl 13, seen last Sunday. By all means, take your cue from the dog and get curious. So ask us anything you'd like to know. Way to do that is in the chat box. Fire away, and we'll take the questions as we get them. What are the monitoring tools that companies are using? Surveys, tracking in Workday, et cetera. Really good question, and that's definitely one of the things that we want to understand better in the survey, or in the study that we're going to be doing. So as far as I know, the primary way that companies are doing that is in looking at their survey data. So they may ask questions about when's the last time you received feedback, or how many times did you receive feedback in the year, and some questions about the characteristics of that feedback. But there are probably other ways to do it, and some of them may be more effective, and I'm not sure what those are. George or Ben, anything to add there?
What we plan to look at in the survey itself is whether or not, for example, the manager's manager is responsible for monitoring surveys such as pulse surveys, and as the questioner mentioned, performance management technology through the systems itself. And those of you guys that work in this area know how difficult it is to get managers to actually do it. We're also asking whether or not HR tracks, whether or not employees provide ratings or other data to managers about the quality of the feedback. So we're going to ask within the study itself about a number of these practices beyond just the report from Workday about who's filled out their performance evaluation in a timely manner. We're much more interested in kind of the managers get feedback about the quality of the feedback that they're delivering.
Okay. Next question is there some data around the impact of focusing the performance feedback on both the what, which that is the goals, and the how, that is the behaviors that employees are displaying. And this is a common formulation that you see in talking about feedback. And George, do you want to tackle this one? Because this is a good one for you with your experience with literature to discuss.
As the questioner rightly points out, this is the state of the art. This is how most companies are doing performance evaluation today, which is a combination of the what and the how, with the what being KPIs, SMART goals, however you formulate that, but mainly the quantitative outcomes of the job, balanced with the how, which primarily come from competency models. There is not a particular study which directly looks at the what and the how together, and we often get questions about, well, is it a 50-50 balance, is it a 60-40 balance? Companies have different formulas for putting these together. What the feedback in research shows is that in terms of quantitative feedback, if you're giving people ratings or you're holding them accountable for certain goals, people have to see those goals as fair. They have to see their ability to affect those goals. In other words, if it's something that I can actually change, that those are going to be the primary drivers about how people react to that. There's much more research on the behavioral kinds of goals, and as I was talking about before, this is mainly goals or feedback that is perceived to be useful on how to improve my future job performance. It's perceived to be fair, and it's non-threatening to me as the individual. And there's multiple studies that look at those components, or either individually and sometimes together. There's not the study out there. There's no research that says, okay, what's the balance between KPIs and behavioral goals? So that's kind of an unsatisfying answer, but that's the kind of the state of the literature.
Yeah, but I think you're right about what you said, George, but the whole thing is the survey that we have, and as Gerry said, it's ready to go. We get at both of these issues.
Yeah.
And the what, the how, and the who, and the attention that's paid to all of those, and then we'll be able to answer the question being asked, is what's the relative contribution of these different facets of culture to the effectiveness of the performance feedback that people say they experience.
Next question that we got is a good one, and that's saying, if the best feedback is positive, how do you handle negative feedback? Now, there are some people that argue, and Marcus Buckingham would be one, for example, that we really ought to just focus on the positive and focus on people's strengths and avoid all this negativity. So my personal experience is that my brain doesn't turn to mush if someone gives me negative feedback. I mean, I like negative feedback, but I don't stop thinking when someone gives me negative feedback if I think that it's given in a way that's intended to be constructive. And I think I'm not the only one in the world, even though my wife does tell me that I'm abnormal. So, you know, I think this is a big issue in the popular management literature. There's less support in the research literature about how exactly to handle it. But George or Ben, any comments on that?
I have a couple comments, and the first one is that there's a set of research showing that different employees are able to handle negative feedback differently. There's different kinds of what's called performance orientation, so that you have to know the employee and their ability to take the negative feedback. The second one is there's a difference between negative feedback, meaning here's what you need to improve, and feedback that threatens the individual esteem. So if you're talking about personality traits, or if you're talking about something that degrades the employee and their perception of their ability to do the work, those are going to have negative impacts on the employee. They're going to shut down. They're not going to listen to the negative feedback. So if it's done for mutual benefit, if it's done to help them perform better on the job, if it's done with a developmental purpose, you can lessen the effects of the negative feedback.
Next question is a good one. Yes.
I think I don't like the term negative feedback. So I prefer the term developmental feedback.
Yeah.
And so if we can get away from the use of this term negative feedback in companies, I think language has an important role to play in the way people experience what's happening to them. And if it's given developmentally, and especially if the person receiving the feedback has had a chance to make their input into what the feedback is going to be, then this developmental thing can work.
Yes, I would agree with that completely. There's a lot of research around perceived fairness and justice within organizations, and in general, what these studies show is that if the procedures are perceived to be fair, even if the feedback that you get is quote unquote negative, that people will still have positive reactions to it, irrespective of the actual outcome, meaning they get a lower rate.
And fairness is one of the things we're going to assess in the present project too.
So a question about what's included in the surveys we're using in the study is, will the survey ask what factors most get in the way of delivering feedback? And we do ask some questions about exactly that kind of thing. And anything to add on that, George or Ben?
I'll
leaf through the surveys while we're doing this?
Yes.
Okay.
So we're asking employees about the nature of feedback that they receive from their managers. And then we're asking managers about the feedback culture that they perceive, the signals they get from top management, the practices in place from HR, how it's rewarded, how it's recognized, etc. So we do have some questions about the mechanics, what's keeping you in the way. In other words, do you have the right systems? Do you have the right data? Do you have the right training? But our main evaluation tool for understanding whether or not you have a positive feedback culture are the responses from the individual employees. And we've got a whole series of questions. Do you get coaching? Is there good goal setting? Do you get good feedback from your managers? And we're hoping to be able to link them together. In other words, employees who say, yes, I get great feedback from my manager, we're going to look at the characteristics of the culture that the managers perceive that lead them to give that better feedback.
Another question about the study and what kind of prior literature is relevant to it. One question is there any research to indicate which of the practices impact the feedback culture more effectively? And we'd have to say very little. So when we did our literature review last summer to try and better understand what had been done previously on performance feedback culture, there was almost nothing there. There is a good conceptual piece. There are a couple of studies, one of which is just is a Harvard Business Review case without a lot of data. So one of the things that we think will be a contribution of the research study is helping answer this question in a way that hasn't been possible up to now.
I think important to add to that is where did this list of practices that we're looking at come from? It came mainly from that literature review, but it also came from the research, and Ben can talk more about this, on climates like service climate and safety climate. What are the things that management can do to try to encourage employees to have a more service orientation or a safety orientation? And we're using a lot of those same practices, the communication, training, monitoring, etc. And we're going to see if those same kinds of things apply in a different domain, mainly how you get feedback.
Yeah, and the thing about this culture idea is that anytime you think that you can find the one or two or maybe even three things that's going to make it, then you're making a mistake.
Yeah.
I mean, the culture thing emerges from the interrelationships amongst the many organizational practices that people experience at work.
Yeah.
For example, in the survey that we've designed, the person who gives the feedback to employees, we assess the generic kind of relationship that he or she has with their employees, as well as the performance feedback style and climate that he or she creates. So you can't separate the performance feedback relationship with an employee from the general employee relationship that supervisors and managers have with their employees.
Yep.
And that's been an error, we think, in the literature, that that it's only focused on the performance feedback process rather than on the relationship that exists between a manager and his or her employees, which is the context in which the performance feedback happens. So we're trying to get at both of those because we think and you know, we've become convinced, but we still want to do the research on it, that when both of those are functioning well, then the specific techniques don't matter as much because the process will be effective as a performance feedback process as part of the everyday life in the organization.
Gerry, can I add one thing before we move on, which is we haven't collected the data yet, but if I had to guess, I'm going to go with modeling. There's one of my favorite studies out there that shows that a large determinant of managerial feedback behavior towards their employees is the feedback that they get from their senior manager. So it rolls downhill within the organization.
So we have a lot of great questions, and we have maybe time for one or two more. So let's try and give really crisp answers and see what we can get in. One question is, and this is for you, Ben, wondering if you've noticed relationships between feedback cultures and themes such as high engagement, teaming, and or development cultures.
I don't know of research on such, but I would guess if I went hunting for it, I wouldn't find much. So I think those relationships exist, and that's why we have these many facets that we're assessing in the survey.
Okay. And maybe one last question. Is there any research on whether behavior actually changes based on good or poor performance feedback? So you want to tackle that one, George?
The answer is yes, for sure, and it's how the employees react. So you have to give feedback in a way that employees accept, and if that's the case, then yes, performance does improve.
Okay, we've reached the end of the hour and have people starting to drop off, so it's probably a good time to call the curtain on this webinar. Thank everyone very much for attending, and I'll turn it over to Martina to close things off.
Absolutely. Thank you. So thank you so much to Gerry and George and Ben. If you missed it in the beginning, we will be sending out the slide deck to everyone on the call today. And that's it. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Have a great day.
Bye-bye, all.
Bye-bye, all.